This is the Garden of English. I'm Tim Freitas. Today we start a series of The Catcher in the Rye.
All right, I am back and looking a little bit older, of course, right? But I thought it was only appropriate to have a nice young child begin our series on The Catcher in the Rye. And sure enough, that's actually what we're going to do. We're going to start talking about The Catcher in the Rye together. I'm going to do a video for each chapter, and I'm going to talk about it. I'm going to talk about favorite parts, talk about things that you might want to actually check out and look into as you indeed scour through this book. Before we do, though, I want to just give a huge shout out to the people that are listed right over there. Those are the Patreon supporters for the Garden of English. I want to make sure that they know that they are indeed quite appreciated, and you'll see their names right there. We are going to start a series on The Catcher in the Rye, and once again, just like I just mentioned, I am going to do one video per chapter, and I'm going to go through it. I'm just going to comment on things that are probably worth recognizing. Is it going to be the most invigorating thing that I've ever done? No, I'm not going to share my screen. I'm not going to share text from the actual book like on your screen. I'm going to go through and I'm going to say, hey, here are some things that I noticed. Here are some things that you want to notice, because I've read this book a million times. And I really, really enjoy it. But I want to make sure that you can pick out all the small things that are actually in here. I hope that you notice I've got my red hunting hat. That's not going to make much sense until you actually read through the book itself. And I also have my nice little Pensy Prep shirt here, which is actually described. The seal for Pensy Prep is described in Chapter 1. So if you read Chapter 1 of The Catcher in the Rye, if you want to read this along with us, or if you're reading it at school, or if you're reading it on your own, when you think about what that Pensy Prep seal looks like, it's right here. So without further ado, I'm going to go through here and I'm going to just tell you some things that you want to consider, that you want to think about, and that you want to bring back to your classroom and say, hey, you know what? Have you ever noticed this about The Catcher in the Rye? And, well, here we go. The first thing I want to point out is that J.D. Salinger himself dedicates this book to his mother. And that's really interesting because notice whose name is not on that list. It does not say to my father. Now, you might say, well, what does that have to do with anything, right? J.D. Salinger, right, before he went... I don't want to say crazy, but before he became more and more reclusive, he was on record as saying that The Catcher in the Rye was a quasi or semi-autobiographical book that allowed him to kind of process a lot of stuff through his childhood. And one of the things that you're going to notice throughout this book is that Holden seems to have issues with the men in his life. Particularly, he does not seem very close to his father. And so I always found that strikingly interesting that the book itself isn't dedicated to his parents. It's dedicated to his mom. And we'll look at Holden as a character throughout the book and see how he interacts with his mom as well. But anyway, if we look at Chapter 1 is, where we get the scene that is set for us, and we see Holden, and he's going to give us a little flashback, and it's going to be a memoir. And we know it's going to be a memoir, not a full autobiography, although we do get a lot of his autobiography in here, because he talks about this idea of how he's going to tell us a story, and it's not going to be about that David Copperfield kind of crap. Now, this is a nice allusion here, allusion with an A, not an I, and this refers to a book by Charles Dickens, which I have read and I did love, but I will tell you, it took me a long time to read that book. I finished it over a span of 9 months while I was doing some other things. So this allusion, we want to realize to David Copperfield, is that if you know anything about David Copperfield, this book is incredibly long, and it actually brings you through a man's entire life. And Holden is basically telling us, that's not what I'm doing here. I want to bring you through just a moment of my life where I might have actually learned something about myself, perhaps. But interestingly enough, right, he does talk about how he's somewhere, and he keeps it really ambiguous. He talks about how he had to come out here and take it easy. And he references this place where he's like, they made me quit smoking in Chapter 1. They wouldn't let me do that. My brother DB comes to visit me at times. And so we don't really know where here is. And we do get an indication of where here is by the end of the book. But right now, I just want to just say, hey, know that it's ambiguous. It's purposefully ambiguous. And know that you should know that. The other thing, too, that I want to just point out is that I know that I had mentioned about Holden's mom, J.D. Salinger's mom getting the dedication of this book. But even as Holden starts the book, within the first paragraph, he talks about how his parents would have a hemorrhage if he told the whole story and things like that. But then he says that'd be the parents, are quite touchy about anything like that, especially my father. They're nice and all, and then he continues, right? But notice how he pinpoints out that his father's the one that that's especially touchy, and he already starts to kind of isolate that. So these are things that we want to actually consider from page 1, where we're like, I should be thinking about this and how this develops Holden as a character. Where is he? We don't actually know, but we might be able to kind of find out. He's somewhere where he has to take it easy. Okay, and then we also know that he's going to tell us a little bit about his life, a particular moment in his life. Okay, and then at the bottom of the first page of the book, he starts talking about his brother DB. And his brother DB works in Hollywood, but before he worked in Hollywood, he was a writer. And he wrote a story about a secret goldfish. But what's interesting about that story, and this is super important, is that Holden thinks that that's his best short story. And that story for the secret goldfish was written for children. You want to pay attention to that. What does Holden favor the most right here? The story for children. And now that DB is in Hollywood and he's a writer for Hollywood, Holden actually calls him a prostitute. He calls him a sellout, and that's incredibly important. Now, on top of that, as you read this chapter, you're going to notice that Holden says a couple things. One of them is he will consistently say things like, "Oh, that killed me." And we want to look at that throughout the book. What this is called a motif. And a motif is an image or a recurring anything that adds meaning to the book. A motif is not a theme, though, but it does help add to the theme. And so you might say, well, all right, Tim, what's the meaning that's added by him consistently saying, "It killed me"? Well, I'm not going to tell you quite yet, but when it shows up, I will indeed tell you when that happens. That'll be in a future video. But we want to realize, how often does he say, "It killed me"? Or we also want to look for how many times he actually refers to death in some way. A little bit further down the page, after he says it killed me a couple times, at one point he talks about how he was not at the football game, and he says it was the last game of the year and you were supposed to commit suicide or something if Old Pensy didn't win. And sure enough, we see that death image kind of coming in again, and we really want to pay attention to that. So we want to highlight that here. Okay, another thing that you're going to see is this. Throughout this particular first chapter, he's going to say a lot of I's, but he's also going to say a lot of U's. And what happens there is when we have an I and a U, there's some exclusion. And because of that, we want to realize that the IU language that he's using isolates. And if you look at all of the images in this chapter, he's incredibly isolated. Everybody else at the school is at the football game, but he's on the hill. And then sure enough, the whole school was there. And he actually says the whole school was there except me. And sure enough, right, as you read on, he's only talking about how he is excluded. He narrates this story about how he forgot the fencing gear on the train, and he talks about how he was ostracized by the team. So we consistently see Holden in this first chapter showcasing in terms of setting in himself the idea of isolation. And so that's going to actually help us with theme as we go throughout the book. So I'm looking at this and I'm like picking up on all of these things, and I'm like, wow, okay, this is really cool stuff. Another thing that you're going to notice as well is that Holden often calls people old so-and-so. So in this particular piece, he talks about Old Pensy Prep. He talks about Selma Thurmer, if you read this chapter, and he says old Selma Thurmer. And then he talks about this history teacher that he's going to go visit, whose name is Mr. Spencer, and he says old Spencer, and then he says old Mrs. Spencer. And we want to really highlight that the word old and the repetition of that word old is also going to be a motif that helps build greater meaning throughout the piece. So we want to focus on that as well. Lastly, I want to point out, Holden does indeed go visit his history teacher, or he's starting to go visit his history teacher, and his name is indeed Mr. Spencer. And what's really important here is this. It's the history teacher. Now, I'm not going to tell you why that's important right now. We're going to see why that's important at the end of the book, right? But the fact that we are starting with him going to the history teacher, right? And the history teacher is the one who studies the past. That's going to be incredibly important. And so because of that, we want to think about all of these things. Those are the nuggets that I have for you for chapter 1 of The Catcher in the Rye. And you might say, well, Tim, you didn't really tell us what any of this means. That's right. Because as we read through this, and I hope that you will read through this together with me, I will then extrapolate on some of the things that I've commented on here as we build meaning, as we get more of the picture of what's going on. But please remember, we want to look out for some of those motifs. We want to see how often Holden says old and, hey, that's killing me. Oh, you know what? There's something else that he actually describes, another descriptor that he uses a lot that you'll see in this chapter, and that is the idea of driving him mad, or he'll talk about madman or something along those lines, or this is crazy. That's another motif. So we've got the old, we've got the pictures of and the references to death, and we've got these consistent references to Madman. And this is just Holden's voice. This is just how he's talking, but we're going to actually see how that actually reveals a lot of elements of his psyche as he goes through this story of our lives. We've got some allusions in here, one of them, of course, being the reference to David Copperfield. If you now know that David Copperfield is a story that takes a dude's life from his cradle to his grave, Holden is saying, no, that ain't me. That's not what I'm doing. We also want to realize, too, that Holden has an issue with his brother selling out and doing, going into adult industries like Hollywood and whatnot, and, just leaving the childhood short story writing behind. And Holden finds the value in that childhood short story. And that's why he grabbed onto his brother when he did. And now there might be a little bit of resentment towards that. So we're here. We're working through things with Holden. And we'll be back probably in about a week or two with Chapter 2. And I hope that you'll consider tuning in. If this video was indeed helpful for you at all, or if you're beginning to appreciate it, maybe you'll appreciate it more when I actually explain things a little bit better, I'm going to ask that you click like and subscribe so that you don't miss any of these videos. And you can go through all the chapters of Catcher in the Rye with me here. And we'll talk about different characters, and we'll continue to talk about theme and motif. Oh yeah, don't forget that we start seeing this idea of isolation. There are multiple pictures of isolation in Chapter 1, which is going to actually help us and understand Holden just a little bit more as a character. If you hate Holden, by the way, after reading Chapter 1, you're supposed to, but you're also supposed to realize that maybe you're a little bit like that. I think about it all the time, right? But we'll talk about that more as we go throughout the book. Please note that you can totally support the Garden of English in multiple ways. One of them is by going to our website and checking out the merch that we have. I hope that you do indeed enjoy this series, because although I'm talking and it's not necessarily the most invigorating thing with pictures and whatnot, this book is probably my most favorite book to teach, and I want to be able to share that with you all. So I hope that you'll stay tuned. Have a great one.